So, as you can see, YouTube has done me a bit of a disservice. Despite spending quite a bit of time on my video, both this morning and last night, it has been impossible to actually save properly with the editing software that YouTube actually keeps within its own portfolio. That having been said, I do have this sort of back way into the possibility, recording over the recording. I don't want to abandon all of the hard work that I put into it, you see, a second time over. So, hopefully this will be enjoyable to any who actually come here and watch it out. I present to you Part 4 of the 100 Reasons Why You Should Reject Islam. Live streamed version. Do 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 do. Greetings, my friends. This is Celeria Rosenkreuz, and once again we shall be diving into the Quran's 100th birthday party. This time looking at the 12th, 13th, and 14th reasons for rejecting Islam. So, without further ado, let us begin. The 12th reason is presented here.
I reserve the right to bring up the breastfeeding adults verse as a separate argument.
You've got dibs.
The Quran is false because it's inferior and contradictory to the way Scripture's methodology is for containing the record of what Jesus Christ said and did. Let me show you what I'm talking about. The prologue of Luke chapter 1. Listen to what Luke says about how he's going to be so careful in his record preservation by talking to eyewitnesses. Luke chapter 1 says this, verse 1, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who are from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, handed them down to us, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in orderly sequence," something the Quran knows nothing about, "most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty about the things you have been taught." Now notice it says, investigated everything carefully from the beginning. Not go into a cave and have an encounter with a choking angel. That's why I do not believe the Quran. The prologue shows it's false.
So, here we can see that the reason to reject Islam, which he is espousing, boils down to this. The Quran and the Hadith are primarily authenticated via a chain of narration, or isnad. This chain is judged entirely based on what names are actually applied to it, and whether or not the people involved are considered to be highly reliable. Unfortunately for the Quran and the Hadith, you have a situation where the actual historicity and quality of the recounted material, which originally is said to have come from oral tradition, is entirely judged based on the level of authenticity and reliability of the individuals in the chain. The problem with this, of course, is that anyone could claim individuals of high reliability are backing the oral tradition of their chain, and thereby we have now many hadith which are contradictory from one another, and you have many which are considered quite authentic while also doing so. The chain of narration, or isnad, is therefore an incredibly poor way of gauging the reliability and authenticity of a text. And this, of course, would be the case even if the Quran and the Hadith were not in fact compiled after the people who actually spoke the words they contained died, and in the case of the Hadith, multiple hundreds of years thereafter. Given that this is in fact the case, you have a significant drop in the reliability of this material. to the point where many scholars actually claim the Hadith are completely unreliable and should not be taken as real histories. The Gospels, on the other hand, have ways that you can very clearly judge their reliability. Not only do you have documents from the earliest church fathers which universally and unanimously attest to the identities of these Gospels, but you also happen to have internal evidence that very clearly indicates that they do belong to who the church fathers are actually pointing the fingers towards. In the case of Luke, whose preface was being referenced in this particular reason, you have a very nice video that was produced by Inspiring Philosophy just recently, which I shall give you a sample of in order to prove my point in this regard.
So when we look at the data, we see the author reported he interviewed eyewitnesses of Jesus and emphasized the importance of eyewitness testimony. He also mentions he was present with Paul during his travels, and the text implies he would have had a perfect opportunity for about 2 years to interview eyewitnesses. Supporting this, we see Luke Acts contains onomastic congruence, something only the best biographies of the ancient world could achieve. The odds of a fictional biography achieving this is highly unlikely. It's far more likely he got his information from eyewitnesses. Additionally, Luke Acts contains a high degree of Semitisms, and yet surprisingly, they are lacking in the we sections of Acts, which indicates his information on Jesus came from Aramaic speakers and are distinct from the sections describing his own travels. And finally, his gospel is filled with language that we would expect a physician to utilize. All this makes a strong cumulative case. The unanimous testimony of the church fathers is correct. The gospel author was indeed Luke the physician, a traveling companion of Paul.
And as such, you have the Gospel of Luke very clearly anchored in history, whereas you cannot even be really sure that the history we know of Muhammad is in any way related to his actual ministry on earth. Unfortunately, this is a very, very weak point for Islam, although you might say it's actually better for the world that this is so. Having proven this particular point to a sufficient degree, let us continue on to reason number 13.
I would have to go with Quran. For my next reason, it'd be Quran 98:6, where dehumanizes Christians, Jews, and polytheists, calling them the worst of creatures. For those keeping track, that would be worse than pigs. Or black dogs.
Well, Jay apologetics.
So, 98:6. Indeed, those who disbelieve from the people of the book and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell, to stay there forever. They are the worst of all created beings. Keep in mind that this categorization of people of the book, which includes all of them, not only all the unclean animals, keep in mind that by saying that they are the worst of all created beings, not the people of the book, and yes, it would be all of them since they would not, are also worse than jinn. In fact, they are worse than Iblis, the shaitan, according to Islam. This is not only incredibly dehumanizing, but an incredibly vile and horrifically incongruent thing for Islam to say, considering there are many other passages whereas you cannot even be really sure that the history we know of Muhammad is in any way related to his actual ministry on earth. Unfortunately, this is a very, very weak point for Islam, although you might say it's actually better for the world that this is so. Having proven this particular point to a sufficient degree, let us continue on to reason number 13.
I would have to go with Quran. For my next reason, it'd be Quran 98:6, where dehumanizes Christians, Jews, and polytheists, calling them the worst of creatures. For those keeping track, that would be worse than pigs. Or black dogs.
Well, Jay apologetics.
So, 98:6. Indeed, those who disbelieve from the people of the book and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell. To stay there forever. They are the worst of all created beings. Keep in mind that this categorization of people of the book, which includes not only all the unclean animals, keep in mind by saying that they are the worst of all created beings, not the people of the book, and yes, it would be all of them, are also worse than jinn. In fact, they are worse than Iblis, the shaitan, according to Islam. This is not only incredibly dehumanizing, but an incredibly vile and horrifically incongruent thing for Islam to say, considering there are many other passages which say good things about the Jews and the Christians earlier on in the Quran. Now, the question becomes why they are the worst of all created beings. Is it simply because they disbelieve in Allah? This seems like it is the most reasonable thing, but at the same time, well, what's the reason for that happening? Let us see what the Quran has to say about that. Here in 488, you see a question being asked. Do you wish to guide those whom Allah has sent astray? He whom Allah sends astray, never will you find for him a way. This indicates no one can actually prevent those who Allah has abandoned from actually remaining in the abandonment. It is useless to preach towards them. Those who reject Allah because Allah has allowed them to be in such a position cannot actually have any sort of redemption unless Allah would will it himself. And you'd think that that would be all fine and good. It doesn't actually directly point the finger at Allah or anything along those lines, unless you keep the rest of the Quran in mind. In particular, you have this passage, 14:4, which directly states, Allah misleads whom He wills and guides whom He wills. As such, Islam considers it not actually to be the free will of the individual which causes them to reach the fires of hell. It is Allah. He chooses whether or not you will actually go and join Islam, and He will make it to where even the most devout of Muslims may very well fall off the path when they are about to die, such that He might enjoy their fires of perdition and allow them to suffer forever. This is not the behavior of a good being. It is not even a matter of some pathetic tantrum on His part. As it says here, Allah is supposed to be all-wise and almighty. He has the ability to actually choose to put all humans away from the fires of perdition according to Islam. He could lead everyone, and yet He chooses to drag those astray whom He wills. As a spiritual being, this stinks of malicious intent. From the beginning, one must assume He chose to lead them down into those fires for no actual good cause. And this includes the Jews, which the Quran also says He loved more than all the worlds at one point. What sort of insanity could drive? What sort of twisted mind would come to these sorts of nonsensical and contradictory behaviors? Allah is not an entity which it would make any sense to worship if you are not some sort of weak, fearful, brainwashed thing. He considers all of His followers to be His slaves, and He doesn't even love them unless they prove themselves to be good servants. This demented thing cannot be the supreme God. The rational mind naturally rejects the idea that such an evil creature could possibly be the Almighty God who created the world. Islam rips itself apart by trying to maintain that farcical stance, and yet, as such, this is a very strong reason to reject Islam. And I suggest very strongly that anyone who hears this should do so. Now then, I suppose we ought to move on to reason number 14. This shall be the final one of this video. Let us see what there is to hear.
Well, Jay Apologetics couldn't be here, but he's done an enormous amount of work on specifically the fact that the Quran is not preserved. And so, to honor all of the work that he's done, I have gone through the video of his choice and have picked out some of the funniest and most intriguing of the issues with the Quran as we have it now. And of course, the Quran says that if it were not from Allah, it would have much contradiction in it. So apparently Allah can sometimes contradict Himself and sometimes make no sense, but if He did a whole lot, that would be a problem. But I would think that maybe you can interpret that as like a real definitive contradiction instead of like many possible contradictions. And one big contradiction is in the various ways that 1181 is recited, because there are two traditions that are very well attested from the very beginning, that when Lot flees Sodom, either his wife is left behind and is not allowed to come with him, or else must come with him but does not look back. And it depends on the grammatical case of wife and accept your wife, which is a clear contradiction because she can't be with them and turning back, but also left behind at the same time. You can't, these are not complementary ideas the way some Muslims will claim. They are flat contradictions and they are equally well attested. There's no way to tell what it originally said. No one has any idea apart from going to the biblical scriptures and using that to edit the Quran, which is apparently what happened, which is why in Hafs we get her coming along with them and then looking back.
Now, I don't quite think that this is something that needs to be elaborated on. Jai and DOC, who I believe are the sources of this, seem to have laid out the argument pretty well. But I would like to point out one additional little issue from the passage. See, here, the angel suggests, "Travel with your family in the dark of the night, and do not let anyone look back except for your wife. She will certainly suffer the fate of the others." This is suggesting that Lot should purposefully choose to sacrifice his wife, and that a man should be willing to abandon his soulmate as such when times of great crisis come up. I ought to make this clear. Allah is herein demanding human sacrifice. Most horrific indeed. Given the fact that Islam claims the moral superiority of all of its prophets and their relative level of infallibility, and given that this is an order coming presumably from Allah, it essentially means that you have a greatly immoral thing being supported. And not only that, you have a contradiction of how the biblical narrative actually works. The angel in the Bible simply asked that Lot and everyone else with him not look back, or else they will suffer the fate of the others. Lot's wife wasn't supposed to look back. She was supposed to follow and survive according to at least the surface level intentions, regardless of the fact that God presumably knew that that was going to happen anyway. So you have a very sort of strange God-enforced malevolence on Lot's part here, where he's supposed to neglect her and allow her to essentially be predestined to fall under a curse from God for no clear reason in the text. I mean, the commentaries on this suggest that the reason must be because of the fact that Lot's wife actually attracted the attention of the people of Sodom to their party there, and that the angels were therefore being disrespected and God threw them. But there's nothing to actually suggest that is true. That's just an attempt to justify and make Allah look more righteous than he actually is in the text. There's no reason that she should be thrown under the bus. Allah is just being a prick. And that is a very good reason in my mind to reject Islam. So I say to you, this has been Celeria Rosencreux, and until my words next greet your ears, farewell. And this has been my horrible attempt to document this failure on my and YouTube's part.